My mom called me, she was crying, and she was like, you need to get to the alley right now. I get to the alley, and then I just see tape. I see a white sheet, and I'm just like, no.
This was during the day when everybody was out. It was blatant, not only because of who the victim was, but of where and when it happened.
The type of person that commits this crime is not a person at all. They need to get revenge, they need to get retaliation. Somebody's going to pay for this.
I'm killing everybody, the mothers, the grandmothers, the kids, and everybody. It's like what you call casualties of war.
Definitely the age of this victim would tug at anyone.
This was a case that brought the city to its knees. If you had a soul, it brought you to your knees.
November 2nd, 2015. It's 4:15 p.m. on a Monday. School has just let out, and Chicago's Gresham neighborhood is teeming with youthful energy.
You go in, you say hi to your family, and you're doing your best to get right back out the house so you can go play with your friends.
The kids and maybe at the park or in front of the house playing.
The Gresham neighborhood was a neighborhood that is closely connected. Everybody knows everybody. We still are under that be back in before the street lights come home type feel.
There was an early dismissal on that day from the school nearby. So there was a lot of children and teens in the park over there at Dawes Park at 80th and Damon.
And then the neighbors heard shots ring out.
They heard some gunshots. Eyewitnesses then discovered a child had been shot across from a park in an alley.
Calls pour in to 911. Within minutes, the Chicago Police Department is on the scene.
He was shot all in the front, I believe 4 times. And I believe one of his hands suffered a gunshot wound.
What appears to be the boys' basketball rests nearby.
A child was shot and killed. This one was different.
Definitely the age of this victim would tug at anyone. There was plenty of people around when Tyshawn was killed. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. It was daylight.
A man on the scene identifies the boy as his nephew, 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee. News reaches his mother.
My mom called me, she was crying, and she was like, you need to get to the alley right now. So I get to the alley. I'm trying to run to his body, but the police is like, no, you can't. We're not gonna let you go there. We don't want you to see that. And then I just see tape. I see a white sheet. My baby body, they got him covered up with a white sheet. I'm just like, no.
Your child, your 9-year-old, your 4th grader. It would have been every parent's nightmare.
I remember this so well. I just tried to go to sleep. And I remember the police officer, he was like, no, Carla, this is not a dream. This is life. This is really what's happening. This is not a dream. You think I started going crazy?
This was a case that brought the city to its knees. Chicago is not new to murder. Chicago is not new to sensationalism. But this particular case, if you had a soul, it brought you to your knees.
For Tyshawn's parents, Carla Lee and Pierre Stokes, having a family was never part of the plan.
I was 15 at the time. Me and Pierre, we ended up kind of like dating. He just liked me a lot. And, I mean, honestly, we both were bad, but I just thought he was better. We always want to go after the bad boys who's tough. We only dated for like a month. Me and Pierre never had a relationship. It was never a real relationship.
But a few months after they parted ways, the teenage fling yielded an unexpected surprise.
I was sleeping a lot, and my mom noticed, she said I started gaining weight a little bit. And I picked up a pregnancy test, found out that it was positive. My mom said she's gonna have this baby, she's gonna raise this baby, and we'll be here to help her. I was scared because I don't know how to raise a kid. I'm just a kid myself. So I was very afraid. I didn't know how I was gonna take care of him.
Well, when Carla got pregnant, I used to always put my head down on her and Tyshawn would just kick and kick. I was excited because I love kids. So, first baby in the family. So everybody was excited.
On January 23rd, 2006, Carla gave birth to Tyshawn.
I was scared because when I finally got him out, he was silent. They spanked him, and that's when my heart was just like, because he was like, ah! I was like, oh, like I got life then. I was like, oh, okay, he's live.
He was excited. He was at the house just waiting for the news. But he comes home, we see him, everybody falls in love with Tyshawn.
Carla raised him with little involvement from Pierre.
When I used to say, Tyshawn, do you want to go over your dad's house? He'd be like, I don't want to go over there. I don't want to go. I'd be like, oh, okay. I mean, I'm not going to force him. If you're not around, he doesn't know you, he don't want to be around you.
In many ways, that was okay with Carla.
Pierre, and he's running the streets. He's getting into it. Everybody, you know right then and now, you don't need to have a baby by that because you never know what's going to happen.
Instead, Carla leaned on her family for support.
My mom used to always get him when he was a baby, so I had a little more time with him. As Tyshawn was growing up, I used to always take them out on outings, go to the zoo, go to the park, out to eat. Basketball was Tyshawn's favorite sport. He got into basketball at school, in parks, the other kids playing basketball, so he picked up on it.
My son always thought that he was gonna make it to the NBA. I did not once doubt him. I told him, baby, you can do whatever you put your mind to. And when we played basketball for the first time, I had never seen my son play like that. You can really play ball. He played ball every day. When he get out of school, he would drop his bags and he would go to the park. He make friends so easily. Like, I'm like, oh, Jesus. Every time I look around, he got a new friend.
In November 2015, Carla had plans to surprise Tyshawn with a big announcement.
Me and my sister was moving in together. We had got a 3-bedroom, and, I was so excited. My baby's life gonna be lit.
But on November 2nd, Carla's plans are shattered when Tyshawn is found shot to death in an alley. His cousin Tiara tells police she'd seen the boy just an hour before.
About 3-ish, I rode around my grandmother's house, seen Tyshawn walking from school. I said, hey, hurry up and go home. And I drove off.
Tyshawn went to his grandmother's house where he left his backpack and headed to the park with his beloved basketball. Within an hour, he was gone.
No words to explain what has just happened. We didn't know nothing and why this had happened to him. We thought it was just like a drive-by or something.
Investigators make the same consideration.
Sometimes children get shot, whether it's a drive-by, they're inside of a home, they get hit with an errant bullet. It usually is an accidental shooting, just an innocent bystander in a drive-by.
But based on the gunshot wounds to Tyshawn's face and head, investigators consider a more disturbing possibility.
All the gunshots were in the front of Tyshawn's body, and one was in his hand. And as detectives, we believed he had his hands up, knowing what was going to happen to him.
This appeared to the responding detectives and officers to be, almost an execution. that is difficult to wrap your head. But then when the target is a young child, is even worse. So from that, it was really spare no expense to try to bring these people to justice.
Somebody was going to talk. Somebody was going to pay.
In November 2015, detectives with the Chicago Police Department are investigating the shocking death of 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee, who was shot in an alley near the park where he played basketball after school.
It's not like this was, done when no one was around. This was during the day when everybody was out. It was blatant, not only because of who the victim was, but of where and when it happened.
There is little evidence at the scene aside from the young boy's basketball. Investigators collect it as evidence.
That's a very difficult surface to get fingerprints from, but some people, even their sweat secretes some minute portions of their DNA evidence, so that's what they're going to recover.
Investigators shift their focus to the stunned onlookers that have gathered at the scene.
We tried to interview as many people as we could that were on the scene, witnesses.
Detectives suspect that the killing was intentional. Witness accounts support this chilling theory.
What the eyewitnesses said is a black vehicle pulled up. Some people exited the vehicle, walked with that child into the alley, and they heard some gunshots, and then the people from that vehicle got back into the vehicle and then drove away.
As investigators search for the vehicle, media seizes on the story. The tragic details capture the city of Chicago and beyond.
This particular crime transcended the boundaries of the city, of the metro area, of the suburbs, mainly due to the cold-heartedness and the age of the victim.
I'm seeing news and blogs, Instagram. I see everyone reposting them, talking about the situation.
When he first got killed, it was all over the news and everything. Somebody just killed a little baby, that didn't stand a chance.
People like, I can't believe this happened, man. How did this happen anyway, right?
The Chicago Police Department holds a press conference in the days after the killing.
I just rushed and we went out there to the scene, to the press conference, and there were so many people out there just trying to give their support and everything.
We need people to speak up. This boy was 9 years old, and he has a mother, and he has a father, and he deserves justice.
A representative from a local church steps up to the mic and offers a $5,000 reward for information leading to the killer or killers. Before long, the reward is up to $54,000.
So now the streets are abuzz. The streets are talking, people are upset, and now it's pressure on the streets because it's not just a Chicago thing. This has hit nationally. You have celebrities, you have newsrooms across the nation reporting on this crime.
Amidst a media uproar and the ongoing investigation, Tyshawn's grieving family plans his funeral.
I was like, hey, I'm ready to do this. I need the best funeral that you can give me. And when I got there, she was just like, don't worry about paying for anything. I got you on everything.
Tyshawn's casket was very customized. His little 9-year-old body was being pulled by a horse and carriage, and they gave him the send-off that was so deserving yet heartbreaking because no one should be burying their 9-year-old child.
It was hard to say goodbye, to let go.
It was a very sober, somber, heartbreaking day for the city of Chicago. People came out, flooded the streets, knowing that this was the day that we were finally going to put Tyshawn to rest.
The funeral is attended by hundreds, including both local and national celebrities.
Nick Cannon came out. And to see Nick Cannon, a celebrity, sitting front and center, he was sitting right in front of me.
As a nation joins Tyshawn's family in grief, investigators stay focused on finding those responsible for his death.
When you have such a microscope on a case like this, you leave no stone unturned and you make sure that you get it right. So you go street by street, literally doing the footwork, talking to who you can talk to.
A few days after the shooting, investigators speak with a man who claims his brother drives a black SUV like the one seen leaving the scene.
We start hearing about Kevin Edwards, and we start hearing about this black SUV that he was driving.
He said in recent days he had been driving a black Ford Edge, and he didn't know where he got the vehicle from, but he knew it wasn't his. His brother hadn't seen Kevin or the car since the murder of Tyshawn Lee.
Investigators check records for anything related to a black Ford Edge in the neighborhood.
As a matter of fact, it was parked one time blocking a driveway, and the Chicago police issued a ticket on that vehicle, and we got the license plate off the parking ticket. Once we had the license plate from the parking ticket, we put that in a database. We found out that the car was reported stolen off the lot from the rental car company.
Investigators issue a be on the lookout on the vehicle. Unsure about Kevin's connection to the case, investigators keep their ear to the ground. Tips begin to pour in, and rumors run rampant.
Normally, you would not snitch. That was not the case with Tyshawn. This crime touched the hearts of so many people. Somebody was going to talk.
Investigators note a theme amidst the chatter.
Rumor has it that there was an inhumane, cruel plan to murder Tyshawn as a result to get back to his father, Pierre Stokes.
Chicago police are investigating the shooting death of 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee. In the days after his death, tips start coming in and an alarming theme emerges.
Tyshawn Lee was murdered because of his father, Pierre Stokes.
It was apparent that there was a conflict between the two little rival groups in the Auburn Gresham community.
In addition to Kevin Edwards, the tipsters placed 27-year-old Corey Morgan and 21-year-old Dwight Boone Doty at the heart of the feud. A feud that began with another killing just 2 weeks before.
We start hearing these names about potential people who was involved. We start hearing about Corey Morgan.
It was discovered that Tracy Morgan, who was Corey Morgan's brother, was murdered in mid-October.
Tracy had his mother in the car. Tracy was ultimately killed and murdered. The mother was wounded.
Corey Morgan believed Pierre Stokes was responsible.
Investigators reach out to those close to the three men.
We started to interview the families. Some people wanted to cooperate, and as usual, many did not.
Those who are willing to talk report that Corey was on a mission in the days following his brother's death.
So Corey Morgan was out for retaliation and revenge, not just for the brutal murder of his brother, but for his mom being wounded. At this point, all bets were off, because one thing you don't do is you don't mess with family, and you definitely don't mess with anyone's mom.
Corey was telling anyone who would listen that the new rule was no rules.
They shot and killed my brother, and they shot my mother. I'm killing everybody, the mothers, the grandmothers, the kids, and everybody.
Somebody was going to pay. Which brings us to Pierre Stokes, Tyshawn's father.
They wanted to make Pierre suffer.
Corey recruited Dwight and Kevin to help him.
These three individuals, Boone Doty, Corey Morgan, and Kevin Edwards, had planned to look for Pierre Stokes, the father of Tyshawn Lee, who they believed was responsible for the murder of Tracy Morgan. Once they couldn't find Pierre Stokes, they would plan every day to go look for Tyshawn Lee.
Investigators tried to question Pierre about the crime, but he does not make himself available for an interview.
He was saying that he had nothing to do with it. Because of his street cred is why they thought that he did it. But he didn't do it.
When detectives question Carla, she tells them she understands why Pierre's reputation is cause for speculation.
Why would they think it's Pierre? Because Pierre's loud. Everything he do, he's loud. He has to be the, everybody knows my name, everybody knows that I'm tough, everybody knows I'm not gonna play with them. They said, do you know if your baby's father know anything about it? I said, I don't know.
She reveals that she has also heard the rumors about Corey's involvement.
Not long after my son was killed, one of Pierre's associates called and said, hey, if the police ask you what happened to your son or do I know anything about anything, tell them that Corey Morgan did it.
But Carla tells them she would be shocked if they were true.
He was known to Tyshawn. We all grew up together. We all from the same neighborhood. We played together, we talked.
But I did say, well, somebody did tell me that just Corey had something to do with my son's murder.
Almost 2 weeks after the shooting, detectives create a photo lineup that includes Corey, Dwight, and Kevin.
We were able to get their pictures, put them in photo arrays, and have the witnesses from the park identify them.
But investigators need more than photo IDs and rumors.
The police didn't want to simply rely on witness identifications, what people felt like they saw. They wanted the hard evidence because nobody wanted to see these guys walk away.
Detectives increased their efforts to locate the black Ford Edge Kevin is alleged to be driving. Over a week after the shooting, detectives get a call from police in Dalton, Illinois.
About 30, 40 minutes away from the scene, there was a strange car just sitting here on a dead-end street or on a residential road where people know it doesn't belong. An officer ran the license plate and said, here's that stolen car.
Chicago police are investigating the shooting of 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee. They believe the 3 men responsible fled in a black Ford SUV. Over a week after Tyshawn's death, the vehicle is found just outside the city.
It was a black Ford Edge abandoned in Dalton, Illinois. And when Dalton recovered it, it was then towed back for further processing.
Forensic experts process the car. They immediately note a strong and suspicious smell.
It's obviously been bleached. It appeared that the offenders tried to cover their tracks by using some sort of bleach within the interior of the car.
But the SUV may hold evidence that can't be destroyed.
They said, is there anything we can get out of this vehicle? We looked online, and it looks like you can do extractions from these infotainment systems. Infotainment system is like the navigation system you get in a car and you pair your phone to it, and it's that navigation portion. Late one night, we went up where the car was being housed. There is a hard drive encased in like a aluminum package. So all it is some set screws and some plugs, and I unplugged it. You hook it up to a laptop through a breadboard and then do the extraction there.
Through the systems in this car, they were able to see where the car traveled, where the car was sitting.
November 2nd, 2015, the vehicle gets turned on and goes westbound, it goes southbound, and then it goes into the mouth of the alley where the homicide is committed.
Investigators are ready to confront the suspects. They receive a tip that Dwight and Corey are holed up at a hotel just outside the city.
My partner and I proceeded to that hotel and set up surveillance and waited for them to come out. Our surveillance only lasted about 30 minutes. Boone Doty and Corey Morgan exited the hotel and were getting in an Uber. At that time, Boone Doty leaned in to open the car door, and his shirt came up and we could see a gun was in his waistband. We knew he was a convicted felon, so we knew we could arrest him for that gun. We followed him back into Chicago We asked for help over the radio, and we eventually stopped the vehicle. Boone Doty was placed under arrest, and the gun was recovered from his waistband. Corey Morgan was placed under arrest, and there was a gun recovered from the duffel bag that was inside the vehicle that they had when they exited the hotel. They were both placed into custody and subsequently charged with unlawful use of a weapon. So that was unrelated to the murder of Tyshawn Lee.
It's soon clear that investigators won't be getting any answers out of them.
Once they were read their rights, they invoked their privilege to have an attorney and refused to speak to us. We had those guns tested that evening by the Chicago Police Department forensics, and neither gun matched the evidence from the murder.
Kevin Edwards is harder to find.
Kevin fled right after the murder, and we weren't able to find him. We didn't know where he was.
Investigators need a break. In January 2016, they get one in the form of a phone call from an inmate at the Cook County Jail, where Dwight Boone Doty is still being held on the gun charge. The inmate claims that Dwight has had loose lips since being booked.
He was bragging about how he killed Tyshawn Lee, talked about how he shot him.
Dwight wanted to tell anybody who would listen about what he did. He's actually bragging and making a rap song that he has shot Tyshawn 15 times. He's proud of this murder. And so now we have someone who basically, has their ear to the ground and say, hey, I've heard about this case. I heard about what's going on.
Detectives need more than a secondhand account.
They wanted to write Doty on jail tapes, bragging on this murder.
Chicago detectives are honing in on the man they believe may have pulled the trigger in the shooting death of 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee. Dwight Boone Doty is being held in the Cook County Jail on unrelated charges, where he is running his mouth to his cellmate about his alleged role in the crime.
Dwight Doty is willingly bragging about the crime that they committed. Keep in mind that this is not a crime that you would traditionally brag about.
On January 12, 2016, investigators outfit the informant with a wire. They listen in as he engages Dwight in conversation.
Dwight was all too happy to give him facts, information. They need to get revenge. They need to get retaliation. Somebody's going to pay for this.
Once they couldn't find Pierre Stokes, they would plan every day to go look for Tyshawn Lee.
Dwight gives up disturbing details, including how he, Corey, and Kevin spent the days before the shooting watching Tyshawn.
November 2nd, 2015, after spending days stalking, watching, preying on this child, this is the day that they decide to make their move. So the men get out the car. They approach him like it's any other day. They see him bouncing the ball. They see him in the essence of his childhood and his innocence, knowing in the back of their mind everything that they were going to do.
Tyshawn was familiar with the assailants. So they were talking to him about basketball and all that kind of stuff. So they lured him to the back alley with the promise of, giving him some video games, talking a little basketball.
Once they lured him into the alley, Mr. Doty began to shoot him. He lifted up his hands to shield himself from being shot at. They lured Tyshawn in this alley, and then they began to, in the most harshest manner, execute this child.
Based on Dwight's recorded statement, investigators have a clear picture as to how Tyshawn's death unfolded.
Kevin Edwards was the driver of the vehicle. Boone Doty, he was the shooter. He's the one who assassinated Tyshawn Lee. And Corey Morgan is the one who orchestrated everything. He's the one that put the plan in place. He's the one that put these guys together. He's the one that called the shots to kill Tyshawn Lee.
By March 2016, investigators are able to charge both Dwight and Corey with first-degree murder in connection with Tyshawn's death.
They're in custody. We got warrants from the state's attorneys, so they approved the charges. So with Corey Morgan and Boone Doty in custody, we had an outstanding warrant for Kevin Edwards. We continued to look for Kevin, but we couldn't find him.
Less than 2 months later, detectives get a phone call.
Eventually, the Danville Police Department stopped Kevin Edwards for traffic violations in May of 2016. That's when our warrant popped on Kevin Edwards. He was placed into custody. We were notified, and we went down and arrested Kevin Edwards.
With Kevin's arrest, the community of Gresham breathes a collective sigh of relief. Almost 6 months after Tyshawn's tragic death, his alleged killers are all behind bars.
Yeah, I was happy. I was like, oh my God, yes, they caught them. Oh my God. I was very happy, relieved.
You hear about it on breaking news. The Chicago police, well, I salute them, because they was on top of it. They caught him so quick.
Prosecutors turn all of their attention to making sure the 3 men stay behind bars. They know the case will not be without challenges.
At this point in time, the police, the prosecutors, they didn't actually have the murder weapon. So they had to get everything that they had to build a culmination of evidence. Every murder is important. Every murder shows a life that was taken. And so naturally, the prosecutors and the police officers want to bring the person to justice. But this case was a lot different. There was not just local pressure, there was national pressure to bring these people to justice.
By 2019, 4 years have passed since the death of 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee. His family and community are eager to see the 3 men accused of taking part in his death face justice.
When you lose your only child, that's really, I don't care what you're doing, where you at. That's all you can really think of. Like, really, that's really all you can think about.
We're talking almost 4 years. 4 years that the community had to wait for justice. 4 years of just wanting to see how this case would play out.
In September of 2019, accused getaway driver Kevin Edwards faces the music.
So Kevin Edwards took a plea deal and was sentenced to 25 years for his role in Tyshawn's murder. He's the one who brought the other 2 to the scene, who blocked in the alley. And so for his role, he was given 25 years.
A month later, the case against Corey Morgan and Dwight Boone Doty goes to trial. They're tried in the same courtroom by 2 different juries. The 2 men are quick to turn on each other as their respective defenses attempt to lay blame at the other's feet.
Corey Morgan is the mastermind, the godfather, the puppeteer. He's the one pulling all the strings and calling all of the shots.
But Corey's attorneys stay focused on the claim that Dwight was the only one who fired a weapon that day.
Boone Doty, he was the shooter. He's the one who assassinated Tyshawn Lee.
Prosecutors argue that both men bear responsibility for the planning of Tyshawn's death and the act of killing him. They present shocking new evidence that, when first conceived, the evil plot was even more sinister than what actually took place.
The plan was to kidnap Tyshawn, to torture Tyshawn, to make Tyshawn beg for his life, to feel everything that they wish that they could inflicted upon the father. This innocent 9-year-old fourth grader.
Even without a murder weapon, prosecutors have plenty of evidence to present to the two juries.
You have the forensic evidence, you have the technology evidence. Now you have this jailhouse informant who has a person that is willingly bragging about the crime that they committed.
Prosecutors also present proof that Dwight handled Tyshawn's most prized possession, the basketball found next to his body.
They bleached the interior of the car. They didn't bleach the basketball, and there was mixed DNA, from what I understand, from the victim and from the offender on that ball.
As prosecutors wrap up, they once again zero in on the callous, cold-hearted nature of the crime.
The type of person that commits this type of crime is not a person at all. The type of person that commits this type of crime is devoid of consciousness, is devoid of a soul, is devoid of checks and balances. This type of person is a person that can do this to a child, go home, go to sleep at night, brag about it, make a song about it, and think it bumps his street cred. That's the type of person you need to be deathly afraid of.
As the trial draws to a close, Tyshawn's family, friends, and supporters are all present. But one face is missing: Tyshawn's mother, Carla.
The prosecutors actually advised Tyshawn's mom that maybe it would be best if she was not in the courtroom and that she kind of sit that out to kind of preserve what was left of her heart space, her mental health.
They don't want me to come because they just felt I won't be able to handle it. Because I don't know where my brain was at. I couldn't really think. I couldn't eat.
For most people, trials bring some type of peace, some type of satisfaction. But here, it was reopening a wound that never healed in the first place.
In early October, the two trials conclude, and the juries reach verdicts for both men.
So now we're here, we're in this courtroom, we're waiting with bated breath.
Dwight and Corey are found guilty of first-degree murder.
And what the jury ultimately saw was two men sitting there who apparently had no remorse, no second guessing about what they had done. So now we see the sentences for Corey Morgan and Dwight Doty come down. Corey Morgan was sentenced to 65 years in prison. And then we have Dwight Doty, who was our shooter, was ultimately given 90 years. Illinois no longer has a death penalty, so that's essentially as being in jail without the possibility of parole for the rest of your life. And then you have some people that will argue that that still was not enough.
There's no sorry for anything that happened to Tyshawn. No apologies would ever be accepted.
Following the verdicts, the city of Chicago grapples with the aftermath of such a heinous crime.
The main thing is just a common story. You had young guys involved in a conflict with another rival clique, and mainly they sought out for revenge by any means necessary. So it's a lot of guys here in the city of Chicago that participate in the same type of thinking right now.
Ultimately, two men were charged with the murder of Corey's brother.
Two individuals were charged with Tracy Morgan's murder, neither being Pierre Stokes. So Tyshawn Lee was killed for no apparent reason.
As the city of Chicago tries to move forward, a mother grieves her loss.
She'll never be okay. And it's okay not to be okay, you know, because she don't got to be okay. It's fine. She's still breathing, though, because she has some type of hope and some type of strand of faith that she's holding on to.
I know I'll probably never be the same, but at least I can attempt to. You know, so when I start feeling down, I have to call my big sister. You know, she talk about how I used to be before this happened to me, and that kind of uplift me. It kind of uplift me, and I'd be like, you know what, you got this.
It was the kind of road that makes people feel small without warning. Endless asphalt cutting through British Columbia's wilderness, flanked by dense forest that seemed to lean inward as if it were listening. In the summer of 2019, travelers on Highway 97 and the Alaska Highway would describe stretches where the world felt stripped down to its most primitive elements: sky, trees, road, and silence so complete it began to feel intentional. Somewhere along that silence, something had already gone wrong. At first, nobody knew exactly where it began. That is always how these stories start, without a clean origin point, without a clear first domino. Only fragments, a burnt-out vehicle discovered in an isolated patch of land, a couple found dead near a roadside pullout, another body farther away, as if the landscape itself was slowly revealing pieces of a puzzle it did not want to hold. And then there were the two young men, Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski. 19, 18. Ages that still belong, in most minds, to beginnings, to indecision, to late-night shifts at retail jobs and conversations about the future that never quite solidify into plans. Friends since childhood in Port Alberni, British Columbia, they had grown up in the same small orbit of familiarity, where everyone knows everyone else's history and nothing stays hidden for long. But something had shifted. Not in a dramatic, visible explosion. Not in a way that friends or family could point to and say, that's when it started. It was more like a slow drift, subtle enough that it could be mistaken for ordinary teenage restlessness. A desire to leave. A desire to become someone else somewhere else. The kind of desire that exists in almost everyone at that age, but rarely turns into something irreversible. On a July day in 2019, they told their families they were heading north to look for work. A common enough idea in rural Canada, where travel for seasonal labor is almost a rite of passage. It didn't raise alarm bells. Not immediately. They packed their belongings, got into a vehicle, and drove into the vastness of British Columbia's northern highways. For a while, they were just two young men on a road trip. Then the vehicle was found. Burned. Completely destroyed. Reduced to a skeletal frame of metal and ash, sitting in a remote area like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence nobody remembered writing. Fire has a way of erasing clarity. It strips objects of identity, leaving behind only questions. Whoever had set it ablaze had not wanted it to be recognized again. And shortly after that, everything changed. Because now there were bodies. Lucas Fowler and China Dees. A young couple traveling together, crossing through Canada on what should have been a shared adventure. They were not supposed to be part of any larger narrative. They were not supposed to become names repeated in news cycles, attached to theories and speculation and headlines that could never fully contain the violence of what had happened to them. They were found along the Alaska Highway, a place where vehicles pass in long intervals and silence fills the gaps between them. Their vehicle sat nearby, stranded and still. Their lives had been interrupted in a moment so sudden that it left no space for preparation, no time for understanding. The world, for them, had simply stopped. Not far from that discovery, another body emerged into the story. Leonard Dyke. A university professor. A man who, by all accounts, had been going about his life in a routine, ordinary way. His disappearance initially did not seem connected to anything larger. But in cases like this, nothing remains isolated for long. Patterns begin to form whether anyone wants them to or not. 3 deaths. Scattered across vast distances of northern British Columbia. No obvious connection at first glance. No immediate explanation that could tie them together into something coherent. But the presence of Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski began to cast a long shadow over all of it. Because they were gone. Not just missing, but actively disappearing in a way that suggested movement, intention, evasion. Their vehicle, once burned, had removed one trace of them from the world. But people like McLeod and Schmegelski do not simply vanish. They move. They travel. They leave fragments behind, whether they intend to or not. Witnesses began reporting sightings. 2 young men in rural towns. 2 figures passing through gas stations, buying supplies, staying briefly in places where they did not belong long enough to be remembered clearly. Their presence was described in pieces: a glance, a brief interaction, a sense that something about them felt slightly off, though no one could say exactly why in the moment. Only later did those impressions harden into suspicion. By the time the Royal Canadian Mounted Police publicly identified them as suspects, the narrative had already begun to accelerate beyond control. What might once have been a localized investigation in a remote region of Canada had transformed into something far larger. A manhunt spanning provinces. Thousands of kilometers of road. Forests so dense and vast that they seemed capable of swallowing entire search efforts without leaving a trace. And the country began to watch. Not in the way people watch fiction, safely distanced from consequence, but in the uneasy way people watch real events unfolding in real time, knowing that every update carries weight, that every new detail has already cost someone something irreversible. Highways that had once been background scenery became focal points. Small towns that rarely appeared in national conversation were suddenly part of breaking news updates. Maps were studied not for geography alone, but for prediction. Where would 2 young men go if they were trying not to be found? Where does movement become disappearance? Where does wilderness become cover? The search expanded. RCMP officers coordinated across provinces. Helicopters scanned forest canopies. Ground teams moved through terrain that resisted human presence. Even the military was brought in to assist, a sign that the situation had moved beyond conventional scope. And still, the forest did not give them up easily. It is important to understand what that landscape looks like in those regions. It is not empty. It is full, but in a way that does not accommodate human urgency. Trees stand close together, thick enough to distort distance. Rivers cut through terrain like indifferent boundaries. Mosquitoes gather in clouds. Mud slows movement. Sound does not travel the way it should. In that environment, time behaves differently. Hours stretch. Efforts blur. Search patterns repeat across ground that has already been covered but never feels fully known. And somewhere within that vastness, 2 young men continued moving. Not toward safety, not toward resolution, but away. Every report of their possible location tightened the sense of urgency. Every dead end added weight. The investigation was no longer just about finding suspects. It had become about preventing whatever came next from happening again. Because by then, it was no longer only about what had already occurred. It was about what they might still do. And that is the moment in any manhunt where tension shifts. When the unknown future becomes more frightening than the known past. When every passing hour feels like a narrowing corridor. Families of the victims waited in a different kind of silence. Not the silence of wilderness, but the silence of uncertainty. Waiting for answers that would not arrive quickly enough, or gently enough, or in any form that could undo what had already been done. Across Canada, people followed updates with a growing sense of unease. The story had all the elements that make headlines stick in the public mind: youth, violence, disappearance, pursuit, vast geography. But beneath those elements was something harder to articulate. A sense that the usual explanations did not fit cleanly. That something unpredictable had already taken control of the narrative. And then, as the search stretched deeper into Manitoba, into marshlands and remote forested regions where roads thin out and human presence becomes increasingly rare, the story began its final turn. Because every manhunt, no matter how vast, eventually reaches a point of compression. A point where movement slows. Where options diminish. Where the landscape that once offered escape begins to offer only exposure. By then, McLeod and Schmegelski were no longer just names in a bulletin. They had become symbols of something more unsettling: how quickly ordinary trajectories can collapse into irreversible events. How 2 young lives, once defined by routine and familiarity, had moved through violence into flight and finally into disappearance so complete that even the vastness of Canada could no longer stretch around them. But the forest was still not finished revealing what it held. And what it would give up next would end the search entirely, while opening an even deeper question that no map, no timeline, and no headline could fully answer. Because the most haunting part of the story was never just what happened on those roads. It was how quickly the road stopped being a road at all. Before anything went wrong, northern British Columbia was just a place people passed through, not a place they stayed to understand. The highways stretched like thin threads across an enormous body of wilderness, connecting towns that felt separated not just by distance but by time itself. Gas stations were spaced far apart enough that each one felt like a small outpost of civilization holding back something older, something quieter, something that never fully left the edges of the land. In the summer of 2019, that region carried its usual rhythm. Travelers moved north toward Alaska. Workers followed seasonal jobs tied to logging, tourism, and construction. Long-haul drivers measured their lives in kilometers and fuel stops. The landscape did not change quickly, but it changed constantly in small, almost imperceptible ways. The shift of light through pine branches, the way fog clung to valleys in the morning, the sudden openness when forest gave way to river or rock. For people like Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski, this environment was not unfamiliar. They had grown up in British Columbia, in Port Alberni, a town where nature is never far away and where leaving often feels like the most natural aspiration. Their childhoods were not marked by anything extraordinary on the surface. They went to school, worked part-time jobs, spent time with friends, and existed in that long stretch between adolescence and adulthood where identity is still being assembled from fragments of influence, boredom, and curiosity. Those who knew them described a friendship that had lasted years, shaped by shared routines and a sense of familiarity that made them almost inseparable. They had worked together at Walmart, a place where fluorescent lighting and repetitive tasks create a kind of temporal blur, where days blend into each other without leaving much behind except tiredness at the end of a shift. It was the kind of environment where conversations happen in short bursts between responsibilities, and where people learn more about each other through presence than through disclosure. Nothing in that setting suggested a path toward what would later unfold. That is often the most unsettling part of cases like this, the absence of clear rupture points. No obvious breaking moment. No visible descent that others can later point to and reconstruct with certainty. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, there are always undercurrents that remain mostly unseen. Briar Schmegelski was known by some acquaintances as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, with interests that leaned toward digital spaces and online content that others might not fully understand or engage with. Cam McLeod was described as more reserved in a different way, less expressive outwardly, someone who did not draw attention easily. Together, they formed a kind of balance that made them seem stable in the way many friendships between young men do, defined more by shared silence than by shared confession. In the months leading up to July 2019, nothing publicly indicated an impending rupture. No documented escalation. No known warning signs that could have clearly predicted the trajectory they would eventually follow. And yet, in retrospect, people often search for meaning in hindsight, trying to locate the invisible hinge on which everything turned. The truth is less convenient. Most lives do not change direction because of a single identifiable moment. They drift. Slowly. Accumulating choices that feel insignificant individually but become significant in aggregate. A decision to leave work early. A conversation about leaving town. A growing restlessness that does not have a precise language attached to it. When McLeod and Schmegelski told their families they were heading north to look for work, the idea fit within a familiar cultural pattern. In rural and semi-rural Canada, young people often travel for seasonal employment, following opportunities that appear in remote regions. It is not unusual. It is not suspicious. It is part of a broader economic reality where movement is often necessary for survival or independence. They packed their belongings into a vehicle and left. At that moment, they were still within the boundaries of the expected world. Family members could imagine their route. Friends could assume their absence was temporary. There was no immediate reason to interpret their departure as anything other than what it appeared to be. But the geography they entered is not passive. Northern British Columbia is vast in a way that resists familiarity. Distances expand in perception as much as in measurement. A drive that appears manageable on a map becomes something else entirely when experienced through hours of uninterrupted road, where landmarks are sparse and repetition becomes disorienting. Highways like the Alaska Highway carry a specific psychological weight. They are lifelines, but they are also isolating corridors. You can drive for long stretches without encountering anything that feels like interruption. Trees line both sides of the road in dense continuity, creating a visual tunnel that can make time feel stretched or suspended. It is in this kind of environment that people begin to feel the scale of the world differently. Small decisions feel smaller. Distance feels larger. The idea of being unseen becomes more plausible. At some point during their journey, something changed. Not in a way that was immediately visible to the outside world, but in a way that would later manifest through absence, destruction, and fear. Their vehicle, which had once carried them northward, was found burned in a remote area of British Columbia. Fire does not simply destroy evidence, it transforms it into ambiguity. What remains after burning is often unreadable, stripped of context, reduced to fragments that cannot easily be reassembled. The discovery of that burned vehicle marked a shift in perception. What had been a missing person situation began to take on the structure of something more serious. The landscape that had previously been neutral now became part of an active investigation. Around the same time, the bodies of Lucas Fowler and China Dees were discovered along the Alaska Highway. The setting was quiet in the way remote roadside areas often are, where traffic is infrequent and pauses between vehicles stretch longer than comfort allows. Their presence there, interrupted so violently, introduced a new dimension to the unfolding situation. Not long after, the body of Leonard Dyke was found further south, adding another layer of complexity to an already expanding investigation. At this point, the geography was no longer just background. It had become a map of points that investigators were trying to connect, each location suggesting movement, direction, and sequence. For law enforcement, the challenge was not only identifying what had happened, but understanding how quickly it had escalated and how far it had spread. The distances involved were significant. The terrain was difficult. The timeline was compressed. And the suspects were moving. This detail is crucial in understanding the atmosphere of the case. McLeod and Schmegelsky were not static. They were not located in a single place awaiting discovery. They were in motion, which transformed the investigation from a localized search into a continental pursuit across highways, forests, and provincial borders. In rural communities along their path, brief sightings were reported. 2 young men passing through, stopping only briefly, interacting minimally. These encounters were often described in hindsight, after their images had been circulated widely and their names associated with serious crimes. Memory, under such circumstances, becomes reconstructive. Details sharpen. Impressions solidify. Moments that once felt insignificant acquire new weight. But at the time of those encounters, there was no certainty. Only fragments of observation that did not yet form a coherent picture. Meanwhile, the environment itself remained indifferent. Forests did not react. Rivers continued flowing. Roads remained open. The natural world did not register the urgency that human systems were now imposing upon it. What began as a journey north had become something else entirely. Not just a physical movement through space, but a narrative accelerating beyond the control of any single actor. Investigators expanded their search. The public began to follow updates with increasing intensity. Maps were studied. Timelines reconstructed. Possibilities considered and reconsidered. And still, McLeod and Schmegelsky remained unlocated for a time, their movements threading through the landscape in ways that made prediction difficult. In cases like this, the setting becomes more than background. It becomes an active participant in the story. The scale of the region, the density of forest, the sparsity of population, all of it contributes to the complexity of pursuit. Distance is not just distance, it is delay. Silence is not just silence, it is uncertainty. And within that uncertainty, the foundation of the case was already shifting toward something larger than anyone had initially anticipated. The setting was no longer just where events happened. It was shaping how they could be understood at all. Lucas Fowler and China Dees did not arrive in Canada with any expectation that their names would one day be spoken in the same breath as a manhunt, or that their journey would become part of a national investigation stretching across provinces and wilderness. They came as travelers, as young people often do, carrying the quiet optimism of distance, the belief that the world is larger than the life they leave behind, and that movement itself can offer clarity. Lucas Fowler was Australian, the kind of young man whose life had been shaped by sunlit geography and open horizons. Friends described him as easygoing, someone who could enter a room without demanding attention but still leave an impression through presence alone. China Dees, from the United States, carried a similar energy, though expressed differently. She was described as warm, engaged, and deeply connected to the idea of experience, as if travel was not just something she did, but something she lived through with intention. They met, like many modern couples do, through intersecting paths of travel and curiosity. Their relationship was relatively new but already carried the intensity that often comes when two people choose to share movement instead of stability. There is a certain emotional acceleration that happens when routines are replaced by unfamiliar landscapes, when each day introduces something new enough to make memory feel vivid. In the days leading up to their journey through northern British Columbia, they were simply two people exploring a country known for its scale and beauty. Canada, for many international travelers, represents a kind of imagined vastness, a place where nature still feels dominant and where roads cut through terrain that resists human containment. That idea, romantic in theory, becomes something more complex in practice, where isolation is not always scenic and distance can carry unintended risk. Their vehicle became their small universe. Inside it, they carried personal belongings, maps, and the quiet expectations of a journey shared between two people learning each other in motion. The road north is not forgiving in the sense that it does not offer constant reassurance. There are long intervals where civilization disappears entirely, where the presence of another human being becomes rare enough to notice. On the Alaska Highway, time behaves differently. Drivers often describe stretches where hours pass without interruption, where radio signals fade, and where the landscape becomes so repetitive in its vastness that it begins to alter perception. Forests do not end, they simply continue. Mountains do not announce themselves, they appear gradually, as if they have always been there but only now allowed to be seen. It was in one of these stretches that their journey ended. The exact moment of what occurred along that roadside would later become the subject of investigation, reconstruction, and speculation, but for the purposes of understanding who they were, what matters more is not the mechanism of their deaths, but the abruptness with which their lives were interrupted. There is a difference between violence as an abstract concept and violence as a sudden erasure of presence. In this case, there was no gradual fading. There was only cessation. Their vehicle was later found nearby, abandoned in a way that suggested urgency rather than departure. In remote areas like this, vehicles are rarely left behind without reason. They are lifelines in environments where walking away is not a simple alternative. The presence of the car, combined with what was discovered around it, began to shift the situation from concern to something far more serious. But before that shift fully entered public awareness, there was still a moment where Lucas and China were simply missing persons. That status carries its own emotional weight for families and loved ones, a suspended state between hope and fear, where imagination becomes a constant companion. Every hour without information becomes a space filled with possible explanations, each one more difficult than the last. For Lucas's family, the distance between Australia and Canada meant that news arrived not just with emotional delay but with geographical dislocation. For China's family, the absence of answers created a similar distortion of time, where each passing day did not feel like progress but like deepening uncertainty. When their bodies were discovered, that suspended state collapsed into something final. The transition from missing to confirmed is one of the most devastating moments in any investigation, because it removes ambiguity while replacing it with permanence. There is no longer space for alternative outcomes. The story narrows into a single, irreversible truth. And yet, even in that truth, questions remained. Because their deaths did not exist in isolation. They became part of a larger pattern emerging across northern British Columbia, a pattern that investigators were still trying to understand. The proximity of locations, the timeline of discoveries, and the emerging presence of Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski began to link separate events into a single unfolding narrative. What makes victims like Lucas Fowler and China Dees especially haunting in cases like this is not only the fact of what happened to them, but the contrast between who they were and the environment in which they were found. They were travelers in a landscape that does not distinguish between resident and visitor, between intention and accident. In such places, vulnerability is not always visible until it becomes irreversible. There is also something deeply disorienting about the randomness that surrounds their presence in the story. They were not connected to the suspects in any known personal way. There was no documented relationship, no shared history that would suggest convergence. And yet, their paths intersected in a place where the chances of such an encounter were statistically low but not impossible. That randomness is often what unsettles people most when learning about cases like this. The idea that movement alone can bring two unrelated trajectories into collision. That a road traveled for entirely separate reasons can become the point at which two stories end simultaneously. As the investigation expanded, the identities of the victims began to take on additional meaning beyond their personal histories. They became anchors in a developing map of events. Each name attached to a location, each location contributing to a broader understanding of movement and sequence. But it is important not to reduce them solely to that function within the investigation. Lucas Fowler was a young man in the early stages of building his life, someone whose future was still open in the way most futures are at that age, undefined but full of potential. China Dees was someone actively engaging with the world, choosing experience over stagnation, presence over routine. Their lives were not defined by their deaths, even if public memory often risks collapsing them into that final moment. For their families, the aftermath was not only about understanding what happened, but about preserving who they were before it did. That effort becomes especially important in cases that receive widespread attention, where narratives can sometimes overshadow individuality. In the rush to understand events, there is always a risk of losing sight of the people at the center of them. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to expand outward from their discovery point, connecting further incidents and drawing in additional victims, including Leonard Dyke, whose death added another dimension to the unfolding pattern. Each new piece of information did not resolve the situation but deepened it, creating a structure that was increasingly difficult to simplify. At the heart of this structure were McLeod and Schmegelski, whose movement through the region was beginning to suggest intention, direction, and urgency. But even as suspicion grew, certainty remained elusive for a time, because the vastness of the environment allowed for ambiguity to persist longer than it might elsewhere. In this way, Lucas Fowler and China Dees became part of a larger shift in the case. Their deaths marked the point at which the investigation moved from uncertainty into active pursuit, from isolated incidents into a connected sequence of events that would eventually span thousands of kilometers. And yet, despite the growing complexity surrounding the investigation, their story remains, at its core, a simple and devastating interruption. Two people on a road, in a place far from home, whose journey ended not by choice, but by a moment that offered no possibility of return. The Alaska Highway does not behave like a normal road when something goes wrong on it. In most places, if an incident occurs, there is noise, witnesses, passing traffic, the possibility that someone will arrive within minutes. But in northern British Columbia, there are long stretches where a single moment can exist without interruption, where time passes without being measured by human presence. It is in those stretches that the deaths of Lucas Fowler and China Dees unfolded, not as a spectacle, but as an absence that would only later be recognized as catastrophic. When their vehicle was discovered stopped along the highway, it did not immediately announce tragedy in a clear way. At first glance, it was just another car in a place where breakdowns are not uncommon. Mechanical failure, lack of fuel, wildlife encounters, weather-related issues, these are normal explanations in a region where distance and isolation often dictate outcomes more than human intention does. But something about this particular scene resisted that normal interpretation. The vehicle sat still, not in the way of a temporary pause, but in the way of something abandoned. Doors, positioning, surrounding environment, each detail began to form a quiet contradiction against the expectation of routine travel. In remote areas, even small inconsistencies become significant, because there are fewer distractions to dilute attention. Every object stands out more sharply against the vastness. It was only when closer inspection began that the truth of the situation started to surface. What had initially been a roadside incident quickly transformed into a crime scene. And once that transformation occurred, everything about the surrounding environment changed its meaning. The road was no longer just a passageway. It became a boundary marking where something irreversible had taken place. Lucas and China were found nearby. The exact moment of discovery is less important than the realization that followed it. There is a psychological shift that occurs when investigators move from uncertainty to confirmation. Until that point, there is always room for alternative explanations, even if they are unlikely. But once evidence becomes conclusive, that space disappears. What remains is the reality of what has already happened, fixed in place and no longer negotiable. For the officers who arrived at the scene, the environment itself became part of the narrative. The silence of the highway, the distance between passing vehicles, the density of the forest surrounding the area, all of it contributed to a sense that this was not a place where help arrives quickly. In such environments, time is not just a factor, it is an amplifier of consequence. The details of what occurred in those final moments would later be reconstructed through forensic analysis and investigative work, but even without those specifics, the outcome itself was already enough to shift the entire trajectory of the case. 2 lives ended in a location far from immediate assistance, in a region where communication is limited and visibility is often obstructed by natural terrain. As news of the discovery spread, it did not remain confined to local awareness. The story quickly expanded beyond British Columbia, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because of what it suggested. A double homicide along a major highway is not an isolated event in perception, it becomes a signal that something larger may be unfolding. At this stage, Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski had not yet fully entered public consciousness as central figures in the case. Their names were still emerging, still being connected to fragments of evidence and witness accounts. But the investigation was already beginning to shift its focus toward them as persons of interest. The transition from unknown individuals to suspects is not instantaneous in investigative work. It is a process built on accumulation of sightings, of forensic links, of circumstantial patterns that begin to converge. In this case, the convergence happened rapidly once the burned vehicle was discovered. That single piece of evidence created a critical junction point, linking mobility, disappearance, and violence into a single investigative thread. As authorities began to map movements across the region, a pattern emerged that suggested significant travel distances within a short time frame. This was not stationary behavior. It was active movement across provinces, through rural highways, small communities, and remote terrain. Each reported sighting added another coordinate to a growing mental map of pursuit. But even as the investigation expanded, the immediate focus remained on understanding what had happened to Lucas Fowler and China Dees. Their deaths were not just data points in a larger case. They were the origin of urgency, the catalyst that transformed a missing persons report into a national manhunt. There is a particular emotional weight attached to victims who are encountered in moments of vulnerability during travel. Unlike incidents that occur in familiar environments, roadside tragedies carry an added layer of displacement. The victims are not in a place where their presence is anchored by routine. They are in transit, in motion, in a state of temporary belonging to the landscape around them. That sense of being between worlds, between departure and arrival, adds a subtle but powerful dimension to how their story is understood. It emphasizes the fragility of movement in unfamiliar territory, especially in regions where distance itself becomes a form of isolation. As investigators worked through the scene, the physical environment offered both clarity and limitation. Clarity, in the sense that evidence existed and could be analyzed. Limitation, in the sense that vast surroundings do not easily yield context. A highway can tell you where something happened, but not always why, and not always how it escalated to that point. What became increasingly clear was that this was not an isolated incident. The emergence of another body, that of Leonard Dyke, shifted the investigative framework further. Now there were multiple locations, multiple victims, and a timeline that suggested movement rather than coincidence. The connection between these events was not immediately visible in full detail to the public, but within law enforcement circles, the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The geography of the crimes suggested progression. The distances suggested travel. And the timing suggested urgency on the part of whoever was responsible. It was at this stage that MacLeod and Schmegelsky transitioned from background figures into central subjects of a nationwide search. Their identities were confirmed, their images circulated, and their movements reconstructed through fragmented reports from across the region. In small communities along their path, people began to recall brief encounters. Two young men passing through, buying supplies, asking questions, staying briefly, then leaving. These recollections, once insignificant, became critical pieces of a developing timeline. But even as their presence was being reconstructed in hindsight, the emotional center of the case remained anchored to the discovery along the Alaska Highway. Lucas Fowler and China Dees represented the point at which abstract investigation became personal tragedy on a visible scale. Their story marked the moment when the case stopped being about missing persons and became about pursuit. It was the moment when law enforcement agencies expanded coordination, when search efforts intensified, and when the landscape itself became part of an active operational field. In the broader context of the investigation, their deaths functioned as both conclusion and beginning. Conclusion, in the sense that their fate was no longer uncertain. Beginning, in the sense that their discovery initiated the sequence of events that would eventually lead to one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history. But within that dual role, it is easy to overlook the simplicity of who they were before everything changed. Two young travelers on a road through unfamiliar territory, experiencing a landscape that many seek precisely because of its scale and isolation. Their presence there was not unusual. Their vulnerability was not obvious. And their final moments were not witnessed in a way that could be fully reconstructed. What remains, then, is not just the investigative significance of their deaths, but the stark reality of interruption. A journey that began with intention, shared between two people, ending abruptly in a place where the world continues moving long after human presence has been removed. And from that point forward, nothing about the case would remain contained. The first officers arriving at the scene did not step into chaos in the way people often imagine crime scenes to be. There were no crowds, no immediate commotion, no urban noise pressing in from all sides. Instead, there was a kind of suspended stillness that felt heavier than sound. The Alaska Highway stretched on in both directions, indifferent and empty, as if nothing had happened at all and yet everything had already been decided. What confronted investigators was not a dramatic spectacle, but a quiet disruption in the expected order of the roadside environment. A vehicle positioned in a way that suggested something had gone wrong suddenly, without preparation or resolution. Nearby, the terrain did not offer many clues at first glance. The forest stood dense and unmoving, its edges blending into the roadside in a way that made the boundary between human space and wilderness feel fragile. Then the confirmation came. Lucas Fowler and China Dees were found not far from their vehicle. The discovery itself did not unfold with clarity in the moment. It came through layers of recognition, verification, and careful assessment, each step stripping away any remaining uncertainty until what was left could no longer be interpreted in any other way. Once that realization settled, the entire tone of the scene changed. The highway, once just a passageway for travelers, became something else entirely. It became a marker of interruption, a place where two lives had been abruptly removed from their trajectory. The surrounding environment, which had previously been neutral, now felt like it was holding on to something it did not explain. Trees, gravel, roadside brush, all of it remained unchanged, but now carried a different kind of weight in the eyes of those who had arrived to investigate. There is a particular quality to scenes like this that resists emotional simplicity. They do not present themselves as purely violent or purely tragic in an immediate sense. Instead, they require time for meaning to accumulate. At first, there is procedure, documentation, assessment, distance maintained for clarity of observation. But beneath that structure, something more human begins to form slowly, as the implications of what has been found begin to settle into understanding. For the officers on site, professionalism required focus on evidence rather than emotion. But even within that focus, the reality of the situation was unavoidable. Two young people had been traveling through this region, and their journey had ended here, in a place where help was not immediately present, where isolation is not unusual but becomes significant only when something goes wrong. As the scene was secured, attention naturally shifted to the surrounding area. In rural environments like this, every detail matters because there is less background noise to obscure important information. Tire tracks, disturbances in vegetation, the positioning of objects, each element can either contribute to understanding or deepen uncertainty. But in this case, the terrain did not offer easy answers. It offered fragments. What investigators were beginning to understand was that this was not an isolated roadside incident. The broader context of recent discoveries in northern British Columbia had already begun to reshape expectations. Another body had been found farther away, and a burned vehicle had been discovered prior to this scene. Each piece was now being re-examined in relation to the others. At this point, the names Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski were no longer peripheral. They were becoming central to the investigative structure forming across multiple jurisdictions. But in the immediate aftermath of the discovery along the highway, the focus remained grounded in what had happened here, at this specific location, to these two individuals whose presence had ended so abruptly. One of the most difficult aspects of roadside investigations in remote regions is the absence of witnesses. In urban environments, incidents are often surrounded by human observation, whether direct or indirect. But here, the land itself becomes the only constant presence, and it does not report what it has seen. It only holds what has occurred, without interpretation or explanation. As daylight shifted and the investigation expanded outward from the initial point of discovery, the emotional distance between procedure and consequence began to narrow. Forensic teams worked carefully, documenting every relevant detail, but even careful documentation cannot neutralize the impact of what is being documented. There is always a moment where the abstract becomes personal, even for those trained to maintain distance. News of the discovery began to travel beyond the immediate area. First within local networks, then into provincial awareness, and soon into national attention. The nature of the case ensured that it would not remain contained. A double fatality involving travelers on a major highway in a remote region naturally draws scrutiny, but the developing pattern of related incidents was already beginning to suggest something more complex. As authorities began to connect timelines and locations, the burned vehicle associated with McLeod and Schmegelski became a critical piece of the puzzle. It represented not only mobility but also an attempt to obscure or disrupt traceable movement. In investigative terms, fire changes everything it touches. It removes identifiers, complicates reconstruction, and introduces uncertainty where clarity might otherwise exist. That vehicle, once part of a journey northward, now stood as an early marker in a chain of events that would continue to unfold across vast distances. The spatial gap between each discovery was significant, but the pattern of movement suggested intentional travel rather than random displacement. Meanwhile, the families of Lucas Fowler and China Dees were faced with the sudden transition from uncertainty to finality. That shift is one of the most difficult in any investigation. Before confirmation, there is always the possibility, however faint, that the outcome might still be unresolved. After confirmation, that possibility disappears entirely. What remains is the need to process permanence. For investigators, the focus remained on establishing sequence. What happened first, what came next, how the individuals involved moved through space and time leading up to this point. But even within that structured approach, there were gaps. Remote terrain does not always preserve evidence in a linear way. Weather, wildlife, and time itself can alter or erase traces before they are fully understood. As the scene continued to be examined, the connection between victims began to take shape more clearly within investigative frameworks. The proximity of locations, the timing of discoveries, and the emerging suspect profile all contributed to a growing sense that these were not isolated events. They were part of a developing trajectory that had not yet reached its endpoint. Still, at this stage, certainty about motive or sequence was limited. Investigators were working with fragments rather than a complete narrative. Each new piece of information added structure, but also raised new questions. The burned vehicle, the sightings of two young men moving through rural communities, the discovery of multiple victims across a wide geographic range, all of these elements were beginning to align, but not yet resolve. What remained constant throughout this phase of the investigation was the environment itself. The highway continued to function as it always had, carrying vehicles through long stretches of wilderness. The forest remained dense and unmoving. The landscape did not reflect the gravity of what had occurred within it. It simply persisted. And within that persistence, the reality of what had happened to Lucas Fowler and China Dees became the anchor point from which everything else in the case would eventually be understood. By the time Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski were officially identified as suspects, the case had already begun to behave less like a conventional investigation and more like a moving system with no fixed center. Evidence was not gathered from a single scene or contained within a single jurisdiction. It was scattered across vast distances of northern Canada, appearing in fragments that refused to align neatly without effort, interpretation, and time. At first, the two young men were still perceived through the lens of absence rather than guilt. They were missing, then sought, then gradually reframed as persons of interest as new discoveries came to light. That transition is never clean in real investigations. It is a slow tightening of focus, where possibilities narrow not because of one definitive moment, but because alternative explanations begin to collapse under accumulated evidence. The burned vehicle found in British Columbia became one of the earliest and most unsettling anchors in that process. It was not just a car reduced to ash. It was a disruption in continuity, a deliberate removal of something that once connected movement to identity. In forensic terms, fire does not simply destroy, it rewrites. It removes readable history and replaces it with ambiguity. That ambiguity forced investigators to treat the scene not as an endpoint, but as a starting point for a broader search. From there, the pattern of movement began to emerge. Sightings reported in small communities along northern routes created a fragmented trail. Two young men were seen purchasing supplies, interacting briefly with locals, sometimes appearing fatigued, sometimes calm, sometimes difficult to interpret in retrospect. Each encounter, on its own, carried no certainty. People rarely remember strangers with precision unless something unusual anchors the memory. But once their images were circulated publicly, those fragmented recollections began to align into a sequence. The investigation quickly expanded beyond a single police detachment. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police coordinated across multiple regions, attempting to reconstruct a timeline that stretched over thousands of kilometers. This was not a case that remained localized. It moved, and the investigation had to move with it, constantly adjusting to new information that arrived too late to prevent what had already occurred. One of the key challenges was the geography itself. Northern Canada is not just large in scale, it is resistant to rapid response. Towns are separated by long stretches of highway where cellular coverage is inconsistent or non-existent. Forested areas are dense enough to conceal movement, and weather conditions can change visibility within hours. In such an environment, tracking individuals who are actively moving becomes less about direct pursuit and more about reconstructing paths after the fact. As McLeod and Schmegelski moved through this landscape, they left behind a trail that was not continuous but punctuated. A sighting here, a report there, a brief interaction that only gained significance after the fact. This fragmentation created difficulty for investigators attempting to predict their next movement. Without a consistent pattern of behavior, prediction becomes speculation, and speculation is not enough to direct operational response. At the same time, the investigation into the deaths of Lucas Fowler, China Dees, and Leonard Dyke was still unfolding. Each case added complexity to the overall picture, not only in terms of geography but also in terms of sequence. Establishing order became essential. Which event occurred first, which followed, and how they might be connected required careful reconstruction of time based on limited physical and testimonial evidence. In the absence of direct surveillance or clear witness continuity, investigators relied heavily on environmental indicators. Road conditions, fuel availability, reported travel times, and digital traces where available all contributed to a developing timeline. But even with these tools, gaps remained. Those gaps became spaces where uncertainty persisted, and where multiple interpretations could temporarily coexist. Public attention intensified as the scale of the search became clearer. What began as a regional investigation had evolved into a nationwide manhunt. The involvement of multiple provinces, combined with the remote nature of the terrain, meant that coordination was not just logistical but strategic. Resources were allocated across vast distances, with search teams operating in conditions that were often physically demanding and psychologically taxing. There is a particular strain that accompanies searches in wilderness environments. Unlike urban investigations, where structure and surveillance provide constant reference points, wilderness operations rely heavily on probability and pattern recognition. Teams must search areas where there is no guarantee of presence, guided only by the possibility that movement may have occurred through a given space at a given time. As days passed, the pressure increased not only on law enforcement but also on communities along potential travel routes. Gas stations, small towns, and roadside establishments became points of heightened awareness. People were advised to remain cautious, to report sightings, to observe but not engage. The presence of two individuals moving through such a vast region created a sense of unpredictability that affected even those far removed from the initial incidents. Meanwhile, McLeod and Schmegelsky continued to evade direct capture. Their movement suggested an awareness of pursuit, though the extent of that awareness was not fully understood. Whether they were actively avoiding detection or simply moving without clear direction remained one of the unresolved questions within the investigation. What was clear, however, was that their trajectory was no longer random. The distance covered, the timing of sightings, and the choice of locations suggested deliberate travel through less monitored regions. This added another layer of complexity, because it meant that traditional search patterns were less effective. Instead of converging on a stationary target, investigators were attempting to anticipate movement that had already occurred. As the search expanded into Manitoba, the environment shifted again. The terrain became increasingly marsh-like in certain areas, with dense forest interspersed with waterlogged ground that made movement difficult for search teams. In these conditions, even well-coordinated efforts could be slowed significantly, allowing time to pass between the moment of passage and the moment of discovery. It was within this challenging landscape that the final phase of the pursuit began to take shape. Reports narrowed. Sightings became less frequent. The pattern of movement suggested either concealment or cessation. Investigators intensified efforts, focusing on areas where previous indicators suggested possible travel routes. Throughout this process, the connection between the suspects and the earlier victims remained the central thread holding the investigation together. Without that connection, the scattered events would have remained isolated incidents. But together, they formed a narrative that pointed toward a sequence of actions spanning provinces and involving multiple lives. Still, despite the increasing focus, certainty remained elusive for much of the investigation. Evidence was strong in places, incomplete in others. The natural environment continued to obscure as much as it revealed. And the suspects, for a time, remained just beyond reach, moving through a landscape that did not easily give up those who passed through it. In the end, what defined this phase of the investigation was not resolution, but pressure. Pressure building across jurisdictions, across geography, across time. A narrowing field of possibilities driven by fragments that gradually aligned into a direction, even if that direction had not yet reached its conclusion. And as that pressure continued to build, the investigation moved toward a point where movement would eventually stop, not because the landscape allowed it, but because it no longer could. By the time the investigation entered its most intense phase, the search for Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski had already transformed into something far larger than a pursuit of two individuals. It had become a test of coordination across provinces, a race against distance, terrain, and time itself. Every new report carried weight, every possible sighting was treated as both hope and risk, because the window for prevention had already closed the moment the earlier victims were discovered. The breakthrough did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It came instead through convergence, through the slow tightening of multiple investigative threads that had been running parallel since the burned vehicle was first discovered. That vehicle had always been more than physical evidence. It was the first clear disruption in continuity, the moment where investigators realized that movement had been deliberately obscured. From that point forward, everything depended on reconstructing a path that was never meant to be easily followed. As the search expanded into Manitoba, environmental conditions began to play a decisive role. The landscape there does not behave like open terrain. It absorbs movement rather than revealing it. Marshlands stretch across large areas, broken by dense forest and narrow trails that can shift in accessibility depending on weather and time. For search teams, this meant that even when they were in the correct region, locating specific individuals required patience that extended beyond standard operational expectations. It was within this environment that the final stages of tracking began to narrow. Reports of sightings decreased, but this decrease did not immediately suggest absence. In investigative terms, silence can indicate many things: distance, concealment, exhaustion, or simply the limits of human observation in vast terrain. The challenge was distinguishing between these possibilities without assuming certainty where none existed. At the same time, the coordination between agencies intensified. RCMP units worked alongside tactical teams and aerial support, adjusting search parameters based on new intelligence and environmental analysis. Each adjustment reflected an attempt to reduce uncertainty, to bring focus to areas where probability suggested movement might still be occurring. The key shift came when multiple indicators began to align rather than contradict. Previously, the investigation had been defined by fragmentation, isolated sightings, separated locations, disconnected timelines. But gradually, those fragments began to suggest a directional pattern. Not randomness, but progression toward a specific region where the suspects were believed to have moved through or remained within. This convergence changed the tone of the search. It was no longer about covering ground broadly. It became about narrowing focus with increasing precision. Teams were redeployed. Resources were concentrated. The operational mindset shifted from exploration to containment, even though the suspects had not yet been located. During this period, the psychological weight of the investigation was also becoming more pronounced. Extended searches in remote environments carry a particular kind of strain. The absence of immediate results does not necessarily indicate failure, but it does create pressure to reassess assumptions continuously. Every hour without contact required re-evaluation of strategy. Every new piece of information had to be integrated into an already complex and shifting model of understanding. For the communities near the search areas, the presence of law enforcement became a constant reminder of unresolved danger. Roads that were normally quiet carried increased traffic. Helicopters became more frequent in the sky. Conversations in small towns began to revolve around speculation, sightings, and uncertainty. In places where daily life is usually defined by routine, the introduction of a large-scale manhunt disrupted the normal rhythm of existence. And yet, despite the scale of the response, the suspects remained elusive for a time. This absence was not interpreted as escape in a simple sense, but as a consequence of geography itself. The environment provided enough complexity to delay resolution, even when multiple agencies were operating with coordinated effort. What eventually marked the turning point was not a sudden discovery, but a narrowing of possibility. The accumulation of negative results in certain areas, combined with increasingly consistent indicators in others, allowed investigators to reduce the scope of the search to a more defined region. In practical terms, This meant that attention could be concentrated rather than dispersed, increasing the likelihood of locating the individuals in question. As the search intensified within this refined area, the conditions of engagement changed. Teams were no longer scanning vast distances for general indicators. They were operating within a framework where proximity had increased probability. This shift, while subtle in description, is significant in practice. It transforms the nature of uncertainty from broad to localized. It was within this compressed operational environment that the final confirmation began to emerge. Not through speculation, but through direct discovery that aligned with all prior indicators of movement and absence. The conditions that had defined the investigation up to that point, fragmentation, distance, and delay, began to collapse into resolution. The conclusion that McLeod and Schmegelski were no longer moving as they had been reported earlier brought an end to the active pursuit phase of the investigation. The search parameters that had guided operations for days were no longer applicable in the same way. What remained was confirmation of outcome, and the transition from pursuit to verification. In cases of this nature, the breakthrough is not only about locating individuals. It is also about establishing finality within a system that has been defined by uncertainty. Every prior decision, every deployed resource, every reconstructed timeline converges at this point. The investigation shifts from anticipating movement to understanding what has already occurred. For investigators, this moment represents both resolution and transition. Resolution in the sense that the active uncertainty driving the search has been addressed. Transition in the sense that the focus now shifts toward reconstruction, analysis, and legal conclusion. The urgency of movement is replaced by the precision of understanding. But even within this shift, the broader implications of the case remain. The sequence of events that began with roadside discoveries and expanded across provinces has now reached a point where narrative and evidence must be fully aligned. The breakthrough does not erase the complexity that preceded it. Instead, it anchors it, allowing the investigation to move into its final phase of interpretation. And in that sense, the breakthrough is not only about what was found, but about the moment when searching itself could finally begin to give way to knowing. By the time the legal and investigative processes reached their final stage, the narrative surrounding Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski had already been defined long before any formal conclusion could be presented in a courtroom. The facts of the case had been established through field investigation, forensic analysis, and cross-jurisdictional coordination. What remained was not discovery, but confirmation, documentation, and the formal closure of a process that had already consumed national attention. There was no traditional courtroom confrontation in the way many criminal cases unfold, because the central figures of the investigation were no longer present to stand trial. Their deaths, determined during the final phase of the manhunt, shifted the focus of justice away from adjudication and toward reconstruction. In cases like this, the legal system does not resolve guilt through verdicts. Instead, it establishes narrative certainty through evidence and official findings. For the families of the victims, Lucas Fowler, China Dees, and Leonard Dyke, the legal outcome could never function as emotional resolution. The transition from uncertainty to confirmation had already occurred earlier, during the investigative phase. What followed was a formal acknowledgement of what had already been understood in private grief, that their loved ones had been taken during a sequence of events that spanned vast distances and unfolded with a speed that left little room for intervention. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, along with supporting investigative units, presented their findings as a structured account of movement, evidence, and timeline reconstruction. This included the sequence of discoveries across northern British Columbia and Manitoba, the identification of the burned vehicle, the forensic confirmation of the victims, and the tracing of the suspects' movements through fragmented sightings and environmental indicators. In the absence of a courtroom trial, the weight of explanation shifted onto investigative reporting and official statements. These accounts were not designed to dramatize events but to clarify them, to provide a coherent structure that could replace speculation with documented fact. Each confirmed detail served as a stabilizing point in a case that had, for weeks, been defined by uncertainty and rapid geographic expansion. The conclusion that McLeod and Schmeigelski had died during the final phase of the manhunt was based on physical evidence recovered at the last known location associated with them. That evidence, combined with forensic interpretation, led authorities to determine that no further pursuit was necessary. This marked the end of active operations and the transition into closure procedures. In legal terms, such a conclusion is not framed as a judgment in the traditional sense. There is no sentencing, no formal declaration of guilt delivered by a judge. Instead, there is an official recognition of outcome based on investigative certainty. The case file becomes the final authority, and within it, the sequence of events is recorded in a way that is intended to be definitive. For the public, however, the absence of a courtroom proceeding often leaves a different kind of emotional space. There is a natural expectation that justice will be witnessed in a formal setting, with testimony, defense, and verdict. When that structure is absent, understanding shifts toward acceptance of documented findings rather than observed adjudication. Still, within the framework of the investigation, closure was achieved in procedural terms. The timeline of events had been reconstructed from departure in British Columbia to the final location in Manitoba. The connections between each victim had been established through geographic, forensic, and temporal analysis. The movement of the suspects had been traced with as much precision as the environment allowed. The official account did not attempt to interpret motive beyond what could be supported by evidence. While speculation had circulated widely during the height of the manhunt, particularly regarding psychological factors and online influences, investigators maintained a cautious stance. The absence of a clear, singular motive meant that conclusions had to remain grounded in observable behavior rather than inferred intention. This restraint is a defining characteristic of formal investigative closure. It does not seek to answer every emotional or philosophical question raised by the case. Instead, it focuses on establishing what can be verified, what can be supported by evidence, and what can be consistently reconstructed across multiple sources of information. In doing so, the justice process in this case took on a different form. It became less about confrontation and more about documentation. Less about resolution through judgment and more about resolution through understanding of sequence and fact. For those directly involved in the investigation, this is often the most reliable form of closure available. Yet even with official findings complete, the broader impact of the case continued to resonate. The geographical scale of the events, the youth of the individuals involved, and the unpredictability of the sequence all contributed to a lingering sense of disquiet within public consciousness. Cases that unfold across such vast distances often leave behind not only answers, but also questions about how movement, isolation, and opportunity intersect in unpredictable ways. For the families of the victims, the formal conclusion marked the end of one phase of engagement with the case, but not the end of its emotional presence. The legal system can establish fact, but it cannot reverse absence. It can define sequence, but it cannot restore interruption. What it offers instead is structure, a way to understand events in a form that is stable enough to be carried forward. In the final analysis, the justice phase of this case was defined not by courtroom drama, but by the consolidation of investigative truth. Every piece of evidence, every confirmed location, every reconstructed timeline contributed to a narrative that, while deeply tragic, was no longer uncertain. And in that transition from uncertainty to documented understanding, the case moved from active investigation into historical record, where its details would remain fixed, even as its emotional impact continued to evolve in the lives of those it touched. Long after the headlines faded and the search helicopters disappeared from the skies over Manitoba, the roads remained exactly where they had always been. The Alaska Highway still cut through forests and mountains with the same indifferent permanence. Trucks continued moving north. Travelers still stopped at isolated gas stations for coffee and fuel before driving into stretches of silence that seemed to go on forever. The wilderness did not remember what happened there in any visible way. Nature rarely does. But people do. That is the strange afterlife of cases like this. The official investigation ends. Files are archived. Search operations conclude. Yet the story continues living in fragments inside the minds of those who followed it, those who lost someone to it, and those who worked it until exhaustion blurred the boundary between professional responsibility and personal burden. For many Canadians, the case of Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski became more than a true crime story. It became a reflection of how quickly ordinary life can collapse into something incomprehensible. 2 teenagers from a small town. 3 victims with no known personal connection to them. Thousands of kilometers crossed through wilderness and remote highways. A nationwide manhunt ending in dense forest far from where the story began. On paper, the sequence can be explained in timelines and evidence charts. But emotionally, the case resists simplicity. Because beneath every fact sits a question that never fully settles. How do 2 young men drift so far into violence without anyone fully understanding what is happening inside them? At what point does alienation become danger? How much of human behavior remains invisible until after irreversible damage has already been done? These are the kinds of questions investigations cannot fully answer because they exist outside forensic certainty. Investigators can reconstruct movement, identify evidence, establish sequence. But the interior world of another person, especially one unraveling in silence, often remains partially inaccessible even after every physical detail has been documented. And perhaps that is what made this case linger in public memory with such intensity. Not only the violence itself, but the absence of a clean explanation. There was no singular motive that neatly organized the tragedy into something understandable. No dramatic manifesto that clarified intent. No long criminal history warning everyone what was coming. Instead, there was ambiguity. Fragments of behavior. Speculation about psychological decline, online influence, isolation, extremism. But none of it formed a complete answer. The result was a story that felt disturbingly unfinished even after it ended. For the families of Lucas Fowler, China Dees, and Leonard Dyke, however, unfinished questions existed alongside a much more immediate reality: absence. Public fascination with motive and pursuit could never outweigh the private reality of grief. Their loved ones were not symbols or headlines to them. They were voices, habits, routines, memories attached to ordinary life. Lucas Fowler was a son whose future had once seemed open and expansive. China Dees was a daughter whose curiosity about the world had led her across countries and into experiences she believed would enrich her life. Leonard Dyke was a professor, a man with routines and responsibilities, someone who existed inside a network of people who expected him to return home. The tragedy of violence is not only the ending of life. It is the destruction of continuity. Every victim leaves behind unfinished conversations, interrupted plans, birthdays that continue arriving after they are gone. The world does not stop after loss, which is precisely what makes grief feel so isolating. Everything keeps moving while one family remains emotionally fixed at the moment they received the call that changed everything. For the officers involved in the manhunt, the aftermath carried a different kind of weight. Large-scale investigations create intense operational focus, especially when the threat remains active and mobile. During those weeks, teams worked through uncertainty, difficult terrain, and constant pressure to prevent further harm. But once the search ended, adrenaline faded, leaving behind the quieter process of reflection. Cases involving young perpetrators often affect investigators differently because they force confrontation with contradiction. McLeod and Schmegelski were not hardened career criminals in the traditional sense. They were teenagers. Young men whose lives, under different circumstances, might have followed entirely ordinary paths. That contrast between age and outcome created a kind of psychological dissonance difficult to fully resolve. It also reignited conversations across Canada about mental health, online radicalization, social isolation, and the hidden emotional lives of young men. None of these discussions produced easy answers. But the case exposed how difficult it can be to identify danger before it manifests outwardly, especially when emotional deterioration happens internally and gradually. There is a tendency after major crimes to search desperately for warning signs because warning signs create the illusion of control. If they can be identified clearly enough, perhaps future tragedies can be prevented. But reality is often messier. Human beings are complicated, and many people experience anger, alienation, or psychological struggle without becoming violent. The challenge lies in understanding when those internal states begin connecting with something darker. In the aftermath of this case, another uncomfortable truth emerged as well: geography matters. The vastness of Canada was not just a backdrop to the story. It shaped the investigation at every level. Remote highways delayed discovery. Dense wilderness complicated pursuit. Sparse population reduced opportunities for immediate intervention. Distance itself became a factor in how events unfolded. There is something haunting about the idea that entire stretches of road can exist where people remain vulnerable simply because there is nobody nearby. That vulnerability is part of life in remote regions, accepted quietly by those who live and travel there. But this case forced many people to confront that reality more directly than before. Even years later, certain images remain embedded in public memory. The burned vehicle abandoned in remote terrain. RCMP officers standing beside endless highway stretches. Helicopters sweeping across forest canopy. Surveillance photos of two young men moving through small towns while the country watched and searched. But beyond those images lies something more enduring. A reminder that violence does not always arrive wearing a recognizable face. Sometimes it looks ordinary at first. Quiet. Young. Unremarkable. Sometimes the people at the center of catastrophic events are not those society expects to fear. And that realization unsettles people because it disrupts the comfort of easy categorization. Yet despite everything, there is another side to the story that deserves equal attention. The response. Communities across provinces cooperated with investigators. Witnesses reported sightings. Search teams worked through physically punishing environments. Families of the victims spoke publicly with dignity despite unimaginable grief. In moments where fear and uncertainty spread rapidly, there were also examples of collective effort, of people trying in whatever ways they could to help bring an end to the violence. That does not erase the tragedy. Nothing can. But it matters. Because stories like this often risk becoming defined entirely by the perpetrators, when in reality the larger human story is about everyone else forced into the wake of their actions. The victims. The families. The investigators. The communities. The strangers who watched events unfold and felt something inside them shift permanently. In the end, the case of Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski remains disturbing not because it offered clear lessons, but because it exposed uncertainty. It showed how quickly lives can diverge from expectation, how fragile safety can feel in isolated spaces, and how difficult it is to fully understand another person before it is too late. And somewhere tonight, along those same Canadian highways, another traveler is driving north through the dark. Forest on both sides. Endless road ahead. The same silence stretching across the wilderness like it always has. The road continues. But for some people, it will never feel entirely ordinary again. Months after the investigation officially closed, there were still people who drove the Alaska Highway more carefully at night than they used to. Truck drivers who had followed the manhunt through radio updates now found themselves glancing longer into the tree line whenever they stopped at isolated rest areas. Gas station clerks in northern towns remembered faces more sharply than before. Travelers who had once romanticized the idea of endless Canadian wilderness began to understand something unsettling about remoteness. Beauty and vulnerability often exist in the exact same place. The story of Cam McLeod and Briar Schmegelski did not disappear when the bodies were found in Manitoba. It lingered because the case never fit comfortably into a single explanation. Even after the timeline had been reconstructed and the search concluded, there remained a strange emotional residue surrounding the entire sequence of events, as though the country itself was still trying to understand how two teenagers could move through so much violence so quickly. In Port Alberni, where both young men had grown up, the aftermath carried a quieter kind of devastation. Small towns experience tragedy differently than large cities. In a major urban center, violence can dissolve into scale, absorbed by the sheer number of people and stories moving at once. But in smaller communities, every event echoes longer because relationships overlap. Teachers remember students. Co-workers remember conversations. Neighbors remember childhood versions of people whose names later become attached to something horrifying. There were people who remembered Cam McLeod laughing during ordinary moments. People who remembered Briar Schmegelski walking through school hallways with his head slightly lowered, avoiding prolonged attention. None of those memories disappeared after the crimes. That is one of the cruelest aspects of cases involving young perpetrators. Earlier versions of them continue existing in the minds of those who knew them before everything changed. And because of that, grief becomes complicated. Not comparable to the grief of the victims' families, never equal to it, but complicated in a different way. Communities are forced to reconcile two incompatible truths at once: that terrible acts were committed, and that the people responsible were once children they had watched grow up. There is no emotionally satisfying formula for processing that contradiction. As journalists continued examining the case after its conclusion, more attention shifted toward the psychological dimension of the story. Online activity, extremist imagery, violent ideologies, isolation, nihilism. Analysts and commentators searched for patterns because modern society has become deeply uncomfortable with randomness. People want causes. They want warning signs clear enough that future violence can be identified before it emerges. But the deeper investigators looked, the murkier the emotional landscape appeared. There was evidence suggesting fascination with violence and extremist historical figures. There were indications of alienation and psychological withdrawal. Yet none of it formed a clean narrative explaining how fascination becomes action. Millions of people consume disturbing content without crossing into violence. Millions of young people experience loneliness without becoming dangerous. That uncertainty left experts frustrated because it resisted easy categorization. The human mind prefers stories with structure. A broken childhood. A specific trauma. A clear ideological pathway. Something direct enough to point toward and say, "There, that explains it." But reality often refuses to cooperate with those expectations. Sometimes violence emerges through gradual accumulation rather than singular cause. A slow erosion of empathy. A deepening detachment from consequence. A fantasy life that becomes more emotionally compelling than ordinary human connection. And when that process happens quietly, especially in young people who already exist somewhat at the margins socially or emotionally, it can remain invisible longer than anyone wants to admit. The case also exposed the emotional distance that can exist between digital identity and physical reality. In online spaces, people can drift into darker forms of content gradually, almost invisibly, surrounded by algorithms that reward extremity and repetition. What begins as curiosity can become immersion. What begins as irony can become fixation. But even that explanation feels incomplete. Because at the center of the story remain three victims whose lives had nothing to do with those internal spirals. Lucas Fowler and China Dees were simply traveling together, building memories across countries and highways. Leonard Dyke was living within the familiar rhythms of academic and personal routine. Their paths crossed with violence not because of anything they had done, but because randomness sometimes places ordinary people into proximity with catastrophe. That truth is difficult to accept because it strips away comforting assumptions. People often want to believe tragedy follows logic. That danger announces itself clearly. That evil appears recognizable from a distance. But the reality revealed by this case was colder than that. Violence moved through ordinary spaces wearing ordinary faces. Two teenagers driving across Canada did not immediately look like the center of a nationwide manhunt. And maybe that is why the story unsettled so many people across Canada and beyond. Not only because of what happened, but because of how little warning the world seemed to receive before it did. For law enforcement, the manhunt became a case study in modern fugitive pursuit across remote geography. The coordination required between provinces was enormous. Information had to move quickly through systems not originally designed for incidents unfolding over such vast distances in such compressed timeframes. Search teams entered environments where the terrain itself became an adversary. Manitoba's dense wilderness and marshlands slowed movement and complicated visibility. Officers searched through insects, mud, unstable ground, and exhausting weather conditions while carrying the constant psychological awareness that the suspects were potentially armed and unpredictable. People often imagine manhunts as cinematic sequences filled with constant action. In reality, they are often dominated by waiting. Waiting for reports. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for a small piece of information significant enough to justify moving resources again. The emotional fatigue of that process accumulates quietly, especially when investigators know lives have already been lost. And then there was the ending. Not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No final confrontation broadcast live. No courtroom confession. Just a gradual narrowing of search zones until the forest finally gave up what it had been holding. The discovery of McLeod and Schmegelsky's bodies brought operational closure, but emotionally, the ending felt strangely hollow to many observers. Perhaps because there would never be testimony explaining motive in their own words. No definitive psychological map connecting beginning to end. No opportunity for public confrontation with the people responsible. Instead, the story simply stopped. And sometimes abrupt endings are harder to process than dramatic ones. In the years since the case, documentaries, articles, podcasts, and discussions have continued revisiting the timeline, searching for hidden meanings or overlooked clues. But what repeatedly emerges is not revelation. It is the same unsettling realization that some stories remain partially unknowable no matter how deeply they are examined. Not every question receives a satisfying answer. Why these victims? Why this route? Why this escalation? Why did two young men decide to continue moving deeper into isolation rather than surrender? The investigation reconstructed events, but reconstruction is not the same as understanding. Perhaps the most haunting element of all is how ordinary everything looked before it became irreversible. A road trip north for work. Two friends traveling together. A couple exploring Canada. A professor driving through British Columbia. Nothing about those separate narratives initially suggested collision. Yet somewhere along the endless highways stretching through forest and mountain, those lives intersected for only a brief period of time. And that brief intersection permanently altered dozens of other lives surrounding it. Parents aged differently after receiving devastating phone calls. Investigators carried memories they would never fully discuss publicly. Communities lost part of their innocence. Travelers began locking doors more carefully at remote stops. People looked at photographs of the suspects and searched their faces for clues that now seemed obvious only in hindsight. But hindsight is deceptive. After tragedy, humans reconstruct the past as though warning signs were always visible. In truth, most catastrophic events only appear inevitable after they happen. Beforehand, they exist hidden among countless ordinary moments indistinguishable from every other day. That may be the most uncomfortable truth buried inside this case. Not that evil exists. People already know that. But that it can emerge gradually, quietly, without dramatic announcement, moving unnoticed beside ordinary life until the moment it suddenly reveals itself in irreversible ways. And still, despite everything, life across those highways continued. Tourists returned the following summer. Trucks continued carrying freight through northern routes. Locals resumed routines interrupted briefly by national attention. Forests grew thicker. Rain washed over gravel pullouts where investigators once stood studying evidence beneath grey skies. The land moved on because land always does. Human beings are the ones who carry memory. And somewhere, years from now, another traveler unfamiliar with the story will drive through northern British Columbia at dusk, watching the last light disappear behind endless trees, unaware that beneath the silence of those roads lives a history most of the landscape no longer visibly remembers. But some stories never fully leave the places where they happened. They remain there quietly, woven into the atmosphere, waiting for anyone willing to listen closely enough to feel the weight still lingering beneath the silence.